history by discussing the court case Obergefell v. Hodges. So I'm just gonna jump right into it. Obergefell v. Hodges is a landmark Supreme Court case from 2015 that legalized same-sex marriage in all U.S. states and territories, as well as requiring states to recognize same-sex marriages performed legally in other states. It was a truly pivotal Supreme Court decision that paved the way for LGBTQ plus rights and marriage equality across the nation. So, for some background on the case, Obergefell v. Hodges began in 2013 when same-sex marriage was legal in 38 U.S. states. But just because it was legal does not mean that same-sex couples had all of the same rights as opposite-sex couples, even in states where same-sex marriage was legal. The Obergefell v. Hodges case brought together multiple cases from the states of Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan. All of the original lawsuits were filed in their respective district courts, and the courts ruled in favor of the same-sex couples, but these decisions were all reversed in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And so their cases were all combined into one case, which is this case, and brought to the Supreme Court to give the final decision. So just to add in some legal jargon, the plaintiffs in this case were 14 same-sex couples, as well as 2 couples whose partners had passed away. And the respondents were officials from the states that I mentioned earlier. And Rick Hodges, whose name is attached to this case, was the director of the Ohio Department of Health. And funnily enough, he actually was not against same-sex marriage and was quoted saying, "I hoped we lost." So he was more of a figurehead just because of his position in the government, not actually his stance on gay marriage, which I thought was interesting. Ultimately, the court decided with the plaintiffs with a 5-4 majority. Now, I just want to explain the legal reasonings that the majority gave for their decision. So, first, they reference the history of marriage, noting that, yes, historically, marriage has been between one man and one woman, but they also note that certain marriage practices have changed over time, such as the decline of arranged marriages and the law of coverture, which I did not know what the law of coverture was when I was researching this case, and I did some Googling, and it's an old legal practice where a woman would lose all of her rights to her husband when she got married. So thankfully that's no longer a common practice, and married women still have their own rights. And then they also recognize the respondents' perspective, which they believed that marriage would be devalued if that right was extended to same-sex couples, but they refute this claim by acknowledging that the plaintiffs valued marriage so much that they wanted that right extended to them, as well as the legal privileges associated with marriage, which, to give you guys a few examples of some privileges that come from marriage, there are tax benefits, Social Security and Medicaid benefits, joint ownership of assets, exemption from estate taxes in the case that a spouse passes away. There are adoption rights, protection for children in the case of a separation spouse in the case that they are incapacitated, etc. So there are more. That's not a comprehensive list, but I just wanted to give a few examples so we can see why it was so important to have legal marriage for same-sex couples. Then the legal reasonings that the majority gives is based in the 14th Amendment, specifically the Due Process Clause, which guarantees all people a certain degree of freedom to make decisions about their personal life and identity, as well as the Equal Protection Clause, which they argued was being denied to same-sex couples in states where opposite-sex couples had more rights. They specify two cases with a similar legal basis, which are Loving v. Virginia, which legalized interracial marriage, as well as Turner v. Safely, which allows prisoners to marry. Then they reference the case Griswold v. Connecticut, which guaranteed married couples access to contraception. And what this case essentially meant was that couples should have a right to intimacy in their own privacy, and they argued that same-sex couples were not being extended this right. And they also mention protection for children of same-sex couples in the form of security and stability. For example, imagine you are the child of same-sex parents and one of your parents passes away. It's not guaranteed that you would, that your other parent would get full custody of you if they weren't able to be legally married. And so you would lose one parent and almost lose access to another, which is obviously a very, very stressful situation to be in, very unstable, and there's just a lot of uncertainty. So they referenced that allowing legal marriage would increase protections for those children. And then finally, they mention the case Maynard v. Hill, which defined marriage as an institution, a legal institution with certain rights and obligations beyond that of simply a contract. So ultimately, Justices Kennedy, Ginsburg, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, while Justices Roberts, Scalia, Thomas, and Alito dissented. I found that to be a little bit alarming, given that 3 of the dissenting judges are still on the Supreme Court, while only one of the judges or justices that ruled in favor of same-sex marriage is still on the Supreme Court. Kind of scary. Now I want to finish up this summary of the case by reading the final paragraph of Justice Kennedy's majority opinion. No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, 2 people become something greater than once they were. As some of the petitioners in these cases demonstrate, marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. It would misunderstand these men and women to say they disrespect the idea of marriage. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right. The judgment of the Court of Appeals was researching this, I was watching an interview, which I'll link below and I highly recommend watching, and I was tearing up throughout the interview because I was so moved by what he was sharing. So I want to just give a little overview of his life and his story. He's still alive, I should say, when I say his life so far. Okay. Reposition myself. Also, if you haven't noticed, my notes are over here, so that's why I keep looking back and forth. Okay, Jim Obergefell is one of 6 siblings born into a Catholic working class family in Ohio. Jim met John Arthur in the early 1990s at a bar through a mutual friend, but at the time Jim was still in the closet, and from what it sounded like from his interviews, he was a little bit intimidated of John, who was openly gay at this point. So at the time, Jim was a high school German teacher, but he ended up quitting his job and going back to graduate school, which is when he came out as gay. And he ended up going back to the same bar and meeting John again, which apparently during their interaction, John said, quote, "You'd never go out with someone like me." And that was that. Until they went to the same New Year's party and came across each other once again, where they fell for each other, and by 1993 they were engaged, although at the time gay marriage was not legal anywhere in the United States. So obviously it was more symbolic rather than them, thinking they actually would be able to get married anytime soon. So they bought a house together and lived essentially as a married couple in all ways except legal. And then in 2011, John was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, which is a progressive disease that attacks the nerve cells of the brain and spinal cord and has no cure as of now. By 2013, John was in need of constant care, and the couple elected for in-home hospice care over fears around discrimination. And keep in mind that gay marriage was illegal in Ohio, where they were residing. And like I mentioned earlier, one of the privileges of marriage is that you can make decisions for your spouse in the case of them being incapacitated under medical care. And so because of the uncertainties around that, they had the care in home, and Jim spent much of his time taking care of his partner. On June 26th of 2013, the Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act in the landmark United States v. Windsor case, which prompted Jim and John to officially get married. And just as a side note, I am thinking of doing a video on United States v. Windsor because it really paved the way for this case and for marriage equality in the United States. Okay. However, Ohio would not grant them a marriage license, and given John's health, they quickly realized their only option would be to hire a medical jet that could fly them to a state where marriage for same-sex couples was legal. So Jim posted on Facebook asking if anyone knew of any pilots or had any recommendations, and no one did, but unpromptedly they donated money to Jim this was a very powerful detail, which is that Paulette had become ordained long before the wedding even happened, because although John's parents were not necessarily supportive of him, his aunt was like that person who was there for him and supporting him, and so she got ordained in the hopes that one day, if John would be able to get married, she could be the one to officiate it, and that is what happened. I think that's so powerful and such a good reminder that, you know, you can be that one person there supporting someone, and, you know, just I guess how meaningful it is to have even one person who's there for you and supporting you, and how, you know, you can be that person too. I just thought that was so powerful. And then once the couple returned to Ohio, they found out that Jim's name would not appear on John's death certificate due to Ohio not recognizing the legality of their marriage. And so they sued the governor and attorney general of Ohio just 8 days after their marriage. The district judge ruled in favor of Jim and John, and when John passed away just 3 months later, Jim says, and I quote, "He died a married man," and Jim's name did appear on the death certificate. However, after John's death, the decision was reversed by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, as I mentioned earlier. So, when asked why he continued the case all the way to the Supreme Court, Jim responded, quote, "It's because of John, because we loved each other and we wanted to exist." And of course, we know that the Supreme Court did rule in favor of Jim, and because of the fight that he took on, all queer people in the United States can now legally marry. So I wanted to add that story because I think, you know, we hear about the case and we know that it's monumental, but we don't always know, you know, what was motivating the people who fought for us. And so I wanted to share his story. Like I said, though, there are 14 couples and another man involved in this case as plaintiffs, and so I'm gonna leave a few links in the description for a couple of their respective stories as well. I don't have time in this video to do them all the justice they deserve in explaining their stories, so I highly encourage you to go out and read about them. And yeah, I just really thought that this would be a very good topic for it being Pride Month, and just spreading a little more information and awareness about queer history and the people who have gotten us to the point that we are now. And like I said, I may do another video about United States v. Windsor, or maybe a few other queer figures from history, so be on the lookout for those videos.